Hello, we're going to predict the Premier League table and where all teams will finish. Who will be first? Who will be bottom? Who will be 11th? And to do that, we're going to look at all of this using the expert football knowledge of Jon Mackenzie. And also, I am here. And so first we're going to look at what happened last season in the table, because we can kind of work out where the teams were, and then we can work out what's changed. So we can see the table. And what did we see, John?
Well, Manchester City won the league. In the end, fairly comfortably, considering that they weren't top of the table for most of the season, but they had a good finish to the season. And I think we can say they probably were deserved victors in the end, although they were challenged all the way by Arsenal. I guess that's the question everyone's going to be asking this season. We're going to see that same dynamic happening again.
Especially when you look at the expected points, you see the underlying numbers often tell you a story as to what you actually see. And so we can see Arsenal kind of overperformed, Man City did as well, but the winners and the best teams tend to overperform these numbers.
Yeah, and whenever I'm looking at a team as they are going to perform next season, I always I assume that continuity is the most important thing, and then I try and work out whether or not they've raised or lowered the needle and go from there. So maybe the best thing for us to do is just take a look at some of these teams and think, have they improved, have they regressed in terms of what they've done over the summer?
So we should start with Man City, I guess?
Yeah, we should start with Man City, because I think Man City, considering they've just won the treble, I didn't feel as though they did a huge amount of business in the window, and I think they've sort of forced their hands a little bit in terms of the way that they're going to play. So we've got them lined up on the board here as they were playing at the end of last season. Obviously, we had this situation with John Stones inverting, forming a box midfield here, but actually in the Community Shield, which we've just seen gone, they sort of played in that 4-2-4 shape that they played a lot in the season before last season. So I guess that does sort of raise questions about whether or not they're going to go and start playing those sorts of shapes again.
Guardiola changes constantly. He was using that 4-4-2, went to the box midfield, but now everyone is copying, so he might then deviate from that. But would he go back to the 4-4-2, do you think?
Yeah, and I think the reason why he would move to that sort of shape is because everyone is expecting a much more central build-up sort of approach. So when you have the situation that we had before, so you have, let's say we had Stones coming inside like this, what you're doing is you're narrowing everything. You're bringing players together in the centre to make it easier to possess the ball through the middle, and what you're going to try and do is work through the opposition press. And I think that Arsenal will have expected Man City to have done something like that in the Community Shield, but actually, as we saw, they used width a lot more, and they only went with the two players in the centre, and it just allowed them to sort of find these balls into the channel through the whole game. So it could be that this is already Pep thinking about, okay, if everyone's going to start coming out playing with these more central build-up approaches, how can we move into the wider areas and use those in terms of moving the ball down the field?
Do you think they'll be better or just different?
I think they'll be different. I think bringing in Kovacic as a replacement for Gundogan will be the interesting thing here, because obviously what we've seen in the past is De Bruyne being played on the outside and playing in this sort of shape. When you have someone like Kovacic, he's going to look a lot more, I think, like a double pivot shape with the midfield rather than Stones stepping up. And so that then raises the question, like, what are you doing with the spare eight? Do you simply just play them alongside the striker and you end up with this sort of 4-2-4 shape? Whether or not we see De Bruyne doing this, I don't know. But I did notice that De Bruyne last season was pressing up in a 4-4-2 shape on the right-hand side, and they used him in the Community Shield on the left-hand side. And I wonder whether or not that's going to be a change in possession as well, where we see De Bruyne sort of floating more as a 10 this season as well. But there's plenty of options for them to do. And like you said, the thing with Guardiola is that he's going to tweak things, he's going to change things around so that no one can really get ahead of them.
Arsenal did something similar. Again, go back to Community Shield. And during pre-season, you've seen them kind of press like a 4-4-2. So obviously Jesus is injured at the start of the season, but they've been doing something similar in their out of possession shape, something like this. Another thing I've noticed with Arsenal is that they've been playing Rice have been playing quite wide. They've got a lot of play out wide, and they're kind of vacating the central space. So it almost looks a bit like this at times. So rather than having all the players in the middle like they have done in the past, they've been moving them out wide here in pre-season. And I wonder if that's a response to something they're playing against, or whether it'll be something they do going forward. Do you think Arsenal are stronger this season? Will they challenge City closer?
I think Arsenal are going to be different this season. I think they're quite hard to read because they've obviously spent a lot of money on improving certain positions in the squad, but they've not really done like-for-like replacements that you would usually expect a coach to do. And so the big question for me is going to be whether or not the way that they then change how they're playing is going to actually be enough to see things.
Is Havertz the answer?
Yeah, well, interestingly, they brought in Havertz, they brought in Rice, both of whom are pretty, physically imposing players, and they've been playing Partey as well as a as the holding player as on top of that as well. And one thing I notice a lot is it feels as though they're going to be a lot more of a sort of counter-pressing team this season. So one of the things I saw them doing a lot was, let's say they're building up from the back and they feel as though they're under too much pressure. They're just happy to play the ball forward and then look for the second ball. And when you have Partey, Rice and Havertz all around in this central spot, then you are able to actually do that. You're able to form these situations where you can actually use that as a decompression device. Just move the ball long, win the ball back, and not worry too much about losing the ball in your own half as well. And also with Arsenal, we know that they're like a really good pressing side. So again, I think we may see them maybe looking a little bit more similar to Manchester United of last season, which is a lot of that was them trying to win the ball in these sorts of areas and then quickly attack into the space as well.
Yeah.
So being a team who not only can create chances through build-up, but also through winning the ball back and then forcing the opposition into these situations they don't like.
Well, who goes here, John?
I'm going to go Manchester City because I'm always going to go continuity, I think. Who goes here? And I think Arsenal as well. I'm going to stick with those two, which is maybe the boring option, but I always have that tendency to think, go for the teams who were there last season, unless you think there's a reason why they won't be there. And I don't necessarily think that there's going to be a huge amount of change up there. But I do think that brings us to Manchester United, because I think of the other teams that we're going to talk about in terms of getting towards the top of the table, Manchester United are probably another continuity option as well.
That's good, because I loaded Chelsea, so that's very useful. And I know you like a hot take. Do you want mine?
I want your hot take, yeah.
My hot take is that I think Chelsea are going to be really good this season. Based on having watched them in pre-season, the new players coming in and that renewed kind of optimism they might have about going upwards rather than being like all the chaos of last season. Last season was nuts. And so you've got a more stable kind of squad and club put together. But now what you've got is a team that looks all right. Like Jackson looks really good in pre-season. Really like just quite skillful, can hold players off, is really, really strong and able to like burst away with pace from people as well. So they've got the number 9 they wanted. They played in Nkunku off the left, rather Mudryk is a good option. You've got both these guys here. The problem they've got is in midfield, still looking for solutions there. They've got the best two fullbacks probably in the league are back. Well, they shouldn't be injured that much this season, but you've got a good backup for James now with Malo Gusto. Sterling seems to be playing off the right, which is maybe not perfect for him, but you get the options because if James is overlapping, of course, Sterling comes in the middle here to be more of a second striker behind whoever's playing number 9. And they still seem to be looking for a number 9 as well. Combined with the way that Chelsea have been pressing, and so like they've been doing that same thing that every team is doing now, where you lead the press with a striker, but Chipman joins in, then these guys join up, and it's like the front four. I just think they'll be really, really decent, and I can see them, a really hot take, is like finishing 3rd or 2nd. Like, it could be. Is that mad?
I think that they will improve. I think they'll finish in the top half for sure, which
half.
They didn't do last season, right? So.
Where were they last season? They were low.
12th or something.
Oh, holy, yeah, that is bad. But that's why I think it's a coherent looking squad and team. They look really impressive in pre-season. It's not even they look impressive, they just look like a good team. And we know Pochettino gets teams to a high level, and with those players, that is a good team. And so that's why I think they could be 2nd or 3rd.
Yeah, I think they'll improve on last season. They'll definitely finish in the top half. But I'm really interested in watching Pochettino actually, because it's been a while since we've seen him in the Premier League, and I think football has moved on a long way since he was there. And there's going to be certain things that I'm looking out for to see whether or not he sort of fixed some issues that I think would have been problems if he was playing the way that he was playing back then today. So that'll be fun to watch.
Well, Frank Lampard couldn't do it, and now we move on to Manchester United, who are they going to be? How good are they going to be, John?
Well, I think with Manchester United, we're going to see them playing very similarly tactically to the way they played last season. What they've done is they brought in some profiles that improve them in certain areas. So they brought in Mason Mount as a sort of backup / eventual successor to Christian Eriksen. They brought in Rasmus Højlund, who, as we know,
Højlund, he says. There's no D. Yeah, it's like Højlund. There's like a D that's in the tongue. Højlund.
Do we have to say that every time?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Obviously, having a number 9, which is a profile they've not really had because Martial's been injured so much recently, I think that's naturally going to improve them. And then obviously Onana replacing David De Gea, which was the narrative of the whole of last season. If Manchester United had a better goalkeeper, would they have done better? So I think what they've done is they're going to play the same tactics but with better players in it. And so the question for me is, what point do their tactics and their approach to start hitting its ceiling? Is it going to be able to hit the
Well,
heights?
there's something that Carl Anka was writing about. He did a video on the channel as well. It's talking about like Ten Hag wants to be the best in transition at the world, but I think it's to do with a lot of the players they already have, the profile. Like, Rashford running in behind, Højlund running in behind or through. He's a bit injured at the moment, so he won't start this season. But they have players, especially Fernandes, who whenever he gets the ball, throws it forward, chucks it forward, which helps having players making runs in behind. So you have to draw teams towards you, I guess. So the opposition teams come and you want to try and draw their line a bit higher so that you can get players in behind, and that means you kind of sit a bit deeper. And like Onana, for me, will be huge because the way that when the ball comes back towards them, they can then recycle play immediately, right, and make those transitional moments much more effective from the back up, because it would come back to De Gea and then go straight out for a goal kick.
I think tempo is really important when we're talking about these sorts of teams, because we've just talked about a number of teams who I think in terms of tempo are quite patient. Like Manchester City, obviously the prime example of that, but the idea with them is that they pass the ball around the back and they essentially bait the opposition forward, and what they want to do then is move the ball through the thirds in a quite controlled way. Whereas with Manchester United, I think what they're trying to do is they're going to be a lot more direct. So they will have these situations where they're building up, but in order to generate these situations further forward on the field where they can then say, okay, now we can find Fernandes in between the lines, and then he can immediately find Rashford. It's a lot more direct, and I think that's
who
we'll
else
see.
do you find?
Højlund.
Yeah.
Højlund. But I think we'll see more of the same from Manchester United as we saw last season, but I think better because they've got better players.
And where did Man United finish?
I can see them finishing third. I could see them maybe finishing second as well.
Oh.
Maybe.
So you've got Arsenal and Man United in second.
Yeah, I think it's between those two who's going to finish second and third.
I like that. Do you know the team that surprised everyone last season got into the top four? Well, that, by Jove, would be Newcastle, who now have to deal with Champions League football. But you've got like Harvey Barnes, Anthony Gordon's not on the board. There he is, that's Gordon, who apparently has had a great preseason. The reason they did so well last season, I think, has a lot to do with them keeping this core group of players. Basically, all of these players played most weeks, and it really worked. There's a thing that's relevant to this season, I think, in that they've changed a lot of the rules in the Premier League this season. So 2 rules that affect Newcastle. The first one being
the Jason Tindall rule.
Jason Tindall, yeah. To stop managers having lots and lots of, I guess, attention on them or something. I don't know what it is. You can't have the manager and another coach in the same technical area barking orders at the same time, only one at a time issuing instructions. So you won't have Tyndall and Howe in the first. Maybe that'll affect Newcastle completely. The other one is that they've changed the rules with time stoppages, so it's to do with people who waste time. Now, the ball was only in play for an average of 54 minutes per game last season in the Premier League, and Newcastle were the absolute best at keeping it out of play. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they take their time between set pieces, so they can be intense and they can push all together as a big unit, and they move up the pitch so they can then press and then to do that relentlessly. That takes a lot of energy. You need time to recover, and that's why I think they sort of had that. Do you think it will affect them at all, or do you think I'm talking nonsense?
No, I think that's a really good shout. I think that a lot of what Newcastle were good at last season was being able to manipulate the tempo again of games, that is where they got a big part of their upside, and they built a team to do that. Right, when you bring in players like Sandro Tonali, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for out of possession.
See the solution to their midfield? Do you think, Tonali?
I mean, it depends what the problem you see their midfield having. But if what you're wanting from Tonali is someone who's going to add intensity and good pressing, then yeah, that's what you're going to get. But for me, the question about Newcastle is similar to the question that Jurgen Klopp faced early on at Liverpool, which was, okay, you can play Premier League football with the team who are going to be really aggressive out of possession, but there comes a point at which you realise that you need to be more efficient in possession as well as out of possession. And then that starts raising questions about the technicality of your midfielders in particular, or where your creativity is going to come from. Interestingly, Eddie Howe is using Trippier, the fullback, to get a huge amount of creativity, and that's what Jurgen Klopp did with his system as well. Sandro Tonali, I guess the argument will be that he is a fairly creative player if you look at his assists from last season, but I think a lot of them came from set-piece deliveries.
Almost all from corners, yeah.
You've got Trippier already on set-piece duty, so I don't think you necessarily are going to get the same sort of upside. But I think the idea would be that you get Tonali into that sort of half space where you get Trent Alexander-Arnold and get him swinging crosses in as well. So,
well, would you like another hot take by me?
Yes.
I think Spurs are going to be terrible for the first few weeks, and then they'll be really good. But the problem is that by the time they get there, it'll be like bad
late.
vibes, basically. So what we've seen so far from Spurs in pre-season is lots and lots of fun football, lots of movement, loads and loads and loads of movement. You've got players moving into midfield quite a lot. They've often at times had basically all their players like this. It's kind of crazy. Like you can almost not throw a blanket over them, because that would be a... Do you think there's a blanket that big that exists?
Yeah, probably.
Have you ever seen a blanket that
make
big?
a lasagna to fill Wembley?
Who did?
That was a big thing that was being talked about in lockdown, wasn't it? Making a lasagna big enough to fill Wembley.
Who made it?
They didn't make it. It was just made up. But if you can make a lasagna big enough to fill Wembley, you can...
Trying to make a rug that big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Well, anyway, if they were covered in lasagna, they'd all be out here, and then we've seen Son and Kulusevski do the wide bit that we know they were doing at Celtic, where he keeps them wide. It's to do with build-up, right? So you get this sort of angle out the way, like that. This sort of thing, and you flood the middles, you've got all these sort of passes. But that's the kind of boring bit. What you really see is loads and loads and loads of movement, swapping positions. You get Udogie in the box, you've got Royal arriving in the box. I like this, it looks progressive and like they're trying to get to a place where it kind of works. But there's certain points when they turn the ball over where you can see they don't know exactly what to do and when, and teams in the Premier League will just go through you.
Totally agree. I think that's the thing, right? With Postecoglou, you know you're getting elite in possession football. The bigger question is what's going to happen out of possession, because it is just a very positive attacking way of playing, with the idea that we're going to score more goals than you. It's quite refreshing seeing managers just come along and say, okay, let's just make sure that our in possession stuff is really good, and we'll sort of worry about the out of possession stuff as it goes.
I like the possession stuff the most. That's my favourite.
Yeah,
that's what I like.
I like the out of possession stuff, but I think both of them obviously are important, and I think what we're seeing now in the Premier League is the elite coaches having to be really good at both sides of the game, and I think that's going to be the big question with Postecoglou, is how quick can the out of possession stuff catch up for him, because it hasn't had to be that good in the last few seasons when he's been at Celtic, but we've seen in Europe there's been issues with the way that they've had to deal with the out of possession approach, and that's led to them being knocked out, even though they were very dangerous in an attacking sense, but I think that there was also a little bit of a weakness.
Yes, I agree. They're probably not going to be top four, so maybe they should sell Harry Kane. They might be sold by the time this is released, you don't know. Sam Ty did a video on our channel, you may have seen, and he talks about Pau Torres not being very good in the air, which is relevant because Tyrone Mings is. And we think Villa will look something a little bit like this here, the 4-4-2 with McGinn. McGinn moves kind of inside, and you get Cash on the outside here. Got a bit of movement here. Diaby can be a 10. Buendia comes inside as well. And then you've got a good decent attack. Villa, what were they last season? They were decent last season, but they were much better when Emery came in, to the point where it seemed unsustainable almost. So I wonder whether you think they can build on last season, and can they challenge the top four? Could they be the team that gets in amongst it?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really fun team to watch next season, because we've already seen season one of Unai Emery. We've seen what he can achieve with a group of players that I think were 17th when he took over at the club, and got them obviously climbing all the way up the table. We made a video about how their approach last season was probably not as sustainable as the league table suggested, but you know what we've seen from Emery's Villa is constant improvement. So we're seeing the development, they're bringing in better players, the system is being better understood by the players that they have, and that means I think next season we're gonna see really peak Unai Emery football, and I really love watching Unai Emery teams play, because they always have a plan. You can watch them and they do the same sorts of things. They have the same sorts of build-up approaches. They have the same sort of attacking routines. They defend in similar ways as well. And I think that works really well to a point. I think Unai Emery teams do so well because the players know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. But I think after a few seasons of Emery, what you tend to see is the players sort of get fatigue of having so much information overload and having to do loads of unopposed practice drills. I don't know if you remember when Villarreal played against Manchester United in the Europa League a couple of seasons ago.
Yeah.
There was a famous training session that Emery did, and he's just walking around on the pitch with a ball, just telling the team to shift their out of possession shape. So if the ball's here, where should everyone be? And everyone moves, and then he moves to the other side. And I think after a while, players get a little bit weary of that sort of amount of detail. So that could potentially be an issue with Villa eventually. But I think this season we're going to get the best of both worlds. We're going to get the attention to detail with the players all understanding where they should be, but also the sort of vigour and interest in the players to be able to enact it as well. So I think it will be a good season for Villa.
Well, one manager who doesn't, or we think doesn't have boring training ground routines is Jurgen Klopp. Now, Liverpool have been amazing for the last few seasons. I don't know, John. They're missing a number 6 because Fabinho's gone, Henderson's gone, that's the captain. That's a big change in the dressing room and the whole club. Sounds a bit football manish, but it's true, right? It's a thing. I know they don't really know what they're doing with this. They brought in Szoboszlai and McAllister. Gakpo was good. And one thing that's useful with this, I was thinking, like, if you do play this box midfield thing that everyone's playing, right, and they do this, that they've been doing, and you play Jones, who's playing as a 6 at the moment, Alexander-Arnold, I don't think this is a great idea to have there. They've got Gakpo who drops in, and so that will beat a 4. If you have 4 players there, that's 5 versus them. So that is useful, and you can get Salah ahead and do this. Very narrow, kind of what they were playing before. Salah, I think, of not having a very good season last season, but actually scored a heap of goals. I think it's like 27 goals and 15 assists or something like that. So it obviously is working somehow. But for me, there's still this big problem with the transition they're doing to putting Alexander-Arnold in the 6th position, where this gap keeps appearing, and he doesn't respond in the time to get back into the shape to prevent balls being played through it. In pre-season, they played Conor Bradley here. I don't have him, let's put him here. It's Conor Bradley. He's been great in that position. He's young, so he'd be quite snappy on it, and you can just play like this and play Alexander-Arnold as the straight pivot. But I don't know if it's a solution. He is good in that position. He's played as a 10 for England, and that might suit him even a bit better because he can play, more with his back to goal rather than facing forward. I don't know what the best solution for him is. But Nunez needs to come in here, but Gakpo suits more tactically what they're trying to do. I don't know if they're going to be... I can't tell they're going to be good or not.
It feels like too much of a style shift away from what they've done before. We've already talked about with Newcastle how Klopp comes in at Liverpool and has this really aggressive counter-pressing approach and then realises he needs to get creativity from somewhere else,
Yeah.
so he changes things up. But they still have that identity as a team who are going to be really aggressive out of possession. And I think this change that they've done here is just, it sort of feels to me too much like they've gone, well, things weren't working for us last season, let's just try and do some of the things that some of the more elite teams are doing. So we'll invert our fullback, we'll form that box midfield.
It does make sense getting the most out of Alexander-Arnold as well, but it's the thing like you pointed out with the high press and stuff, it all falls apart when you start putting people out wide, you leave the space in the middle to...
Yeah, but what we've said is that when you invert your fullback like this, and you then have your situational back three, there's a couple of problems. One is that you've got Robertson now playing as an outside centre-back, which isn't ideal. So
he's basically a winger, I think.
Yeah, they'd have to bring someone in here to fill this out. And then the problem becomes that if you're, like you said, if you're using your wide players quite narrow in the attacking line, then you're losing width. And so what you end up doing is moving out your centre midfielders to be width providers. Now that was great last season because they had Curtis Jones, who was drifting onto the sideline and was just, he'd played as a winger, I think, earlier in his career. It suited him really, really well. But the problem is now you've brought in two players in Szoboszlai and Alexis McAllister, who I think you want to use them to sort of solve the problems that this was designed to overcome, which was we're getting run through the middle a lot. So if we invert the fullback, we're then getting a double pivot in certain situations when we've got turnovers. And now you've got this situation now where you've got McAllister and Szoboszlai, and you kind of think, well, could you not go back to the previous approach and rely on them being good out of possession, so that you don't need to form that box midfield with Alexander-Arnold coming inside. There's a lot of moving parts, and like Alexander-Arnold is still learning that role. I don't think he's particularly good at pinning as a pivot player. So often when you're playing as a pivot, what you're wanting to do is get inside the opposition block to manipulate space so that you can build up through the middle. Actually, what we started seeing more with Alexander-Arnold was he was sitting outside the block, and then it just changes the sorts of angles that he's then got to be able to pass from. So it just opens up a number. We know he's one of the best ball strikers in the world. If you can have him here playing this assortment of passes, then he's offering a lot more than if he's here and basically he's reduced to sort of balls down the line or cross-field balls. So I can see the logic behind that, and I think that that's something that they will work with, but I still don't think that they really have the squad to be able to function in this way if they don't have a six, because Fabinho's gone, and if they're playing Robertson as an outside centre-back. So I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about the way that Liverpool are going to play, and as a result of that, I just think that they'll maybe still be experimenting throughout the course of next season as well. So I don't think they're really going to be challenging for the top. But like you said, they have like an incredible, raft of players that they can rely on to score goals, and that can often be enough. But yeah, I don't think I've said who I think is going to finish fourth yet. But
no, you speak it now. City. I think City.
Yeah.
I think Arsenal or Chelsea here. Probably United. Manchester. And then...
I mean, you're going to have to put Chelsea or Arsenal there, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's 4 teams.
Yeah, that's the 4 teams, yeah. I can see Liverpool breaking. I think Newcastle drop out because the change with having European football will change things and it will affect the way that they play going forward. I think Liverpool are kind of stuck in a mixture of... They haven't brought in enough new players yet to be set. The tactical profile hasn't quite been made clear and they're lacking the momentum they've had in previous seasons where it feels like it's building. And I think there's something to that. But equally, they could be, I don't want to say that they could also be really good, but I think there's something just not quite there. So I'd put them round about like 5th or just outside it, but could get into the next mistake.
I think I'd probably put Liverpool or Chelsea in the 4th spot, depending on which way it goes. But with both of them, there's so many moving parts, right? Chelsea got a new manager, lots of new players, etc. And then with Liverpool, it's such a different style from what they've been playing before. That and we saw at the end of last season, yes, it works. They had a good run of games where they were able to get some upside from that approach. But those were teams that you would have expected them to beat if they hadn't have had the season that they just had. So it could be the case that we see Liverpool come in next season, try and play this system to start off with, but then revert back to more of their 4-3-3 with, pushing the fullbacks forward rather than having the fullback inverting. So I could see that happening as well. So I feel with Chelsea and Liverpool, there's so much potential variables in play that I'm just not confident in calling it either way.
But there are even more teams. One of the teams is Brighton. Brighton will be good, won't they?
I think so, yeah. The big question with Brighton is always that they're going to sell on their best players.
Yeah.
So have they got the players coming through who are going to replace them?
Well, I think João Pedro will be very good for them as a striker. Also, other teams, just to not do the entire league, will be here forever. But we've got Brighton, obviously, will be quite close to it, we think, probably around about 7th or 8th, because they're a strong team on De Zerbi. Villa probably around that as well, amongst with Spurs probably, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then if you go down from there, Brentford should be amongst it. Ivan Toney's a huge miss because not just for the goals that he scores, but a lot of Brentford's play goes down the left side from goal kicks or even just building down through Rico Henry. And a lot of the long passes they will make go towards Toney because he can take them down. So without him, they'll change a lot of what they do, but most of their goals come from set pieces anyway. So probably finer on there. Basically, this whole part of the table is where it doesn't really matter. And then we come to the teams who will get relegated. Who's going to get relegated, John?
Yeah, this is not nice to talk about, is it? But there's a couple of teams who've come up who I'm not convinced are going to stay in the league. One of them is Luton. I think Luton have had an incredible rise up through the football leagues. And I think they're well ahead of the schedule they've set for themselves. So I think they'll treat this season as a sort of bonus season to spend some time in the Premier League, get used to being in the league, also enjoy getting the TV revenues that you get from being in the league, and they'll build a squad that will allow them to get promoted again if they drop down. So I think
they'll take points off big teams, I bet.
I think they'll
like
be
Liverpool or like Arsenal or something like that. They'll take points off of them.
Yeah, I think that they'll be that they will have a plan, but I do think that there's only so much you can do with what you have, and I think the same is probably true of Sheffield United as well. So I've got those two down as being the ones that I'm fairly convinced will go down.
Luton, I tend to agree with you. They play a quite aggressive 5-3-2. They throw the ball forward and chase it. I think it'll get taken apart in the Premier League, but they'll get the occasional 1-0 and really strong 0-0, or even like a lucky 2-0 now and again. But I just can't see them getting that many points out of it. It'll be a bit like Southampton, I think, actually, in a way. And then what you've got there after is Sheffield United, who have sold their best player. Apparently only wants to get rid. So they're just not in the best place. If Heckingbottom keeps them up, it'd be a very impressive feat. And then Everton, West Ham, who are struggling pre-season especially. Palace have lost Wilfried Zaha. Michael Olise might go. Wolves are in a bit of a state.
Wolves have sold everyone.
Yeah, they don't have anyone left.
Yeah.
So that could be a big one. Nottingham Forest haven't really strengthened. They've lost a few players, like Keylor Navas is gone. Burnley, I wonder how well they'll do, because the way that Company's team plays is fun to watch, but then you need better players. Like, you can do it in the Championship. We were discussing this earlier. Like, you can do this in the Championship because you have really good players to that standard, but when you try and play that football in the Premier League with players who aren't quite as good, it can often go wrong.
And it's tough as well, I think, going from being a dominant team in one league to then being the underdogs in the next league, right? It's a really tough dynamic to manage as well. And I noticed you jumped over Bournemouth in that list there because I'm a big fan of Andoni Iraola and Bournemouth. So I think you've been kind to me, but I think they're definitely in that conversation as well. He's a new manager coming in. He's going to play a really different style of football with the players that he's got.
So the league next season is going to look like Man City probably winning it, because that's what seems to happen. Then probably Arsenal or Chelsea, or Man United. That's the 4. And then we've got probably Newcastle, Liverpool, Tottenham in amongst it, with Villa, and then a bunch of teams, doesn't really matter. And then we go down to the lower part, and it's probably Sheffield United relegated, or Luton, with 5 others.
With anyone else. Yeah.
That's the league, that's how it's going to look. And so now that brings us to our quickfire predictions round. The music has begun. And so I'm going to just ask you quickfire predictions, John. You ready?
It's going to be boring because I'm just going to go with what happened last season. But yeah, let's see.
Who will be top scorer?
Holland.
Who will be second top scorer?
Salah.
Who will be third top scorer?
I have no idea. Evan Ferguson.
Who will be fourth top scorer?
I've run out of players. I'll say Højlund. Just did it. Lund.
Who will provide the most assists?
Kevin De Bruyne.
Who will provide the second most assists?
Trent Alexander-Arnold.
Which team will get the most red cards?
Wolves.
Who is your dark horse?
I'll say Bournemouth, but I'm not committed to that.
Who is your light horse?
I don't know what that means.
Who is the best horse?
The best horse is Manchester City, of course.
What is a horse?
A horse is a 4-legged creature, mammalian, and often used to transport humans from one place to another.
Can you draw a horse?
Sure. I've made him quite hench. I'm going to add perspective.
This is all part of football analysis. Fantastic. There we go, John. It's a really nice horse, John, thank you.
It's quite hench, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look at its legs. It's quite skinny.
Very powerful.
So I give it a 6-pack.
Let's see the horse with 6-pack.
That's kind of weird, isn't
I
it?
don't know what's going on.
I gave it pecs as well.
Show up to the camera front on so we can see it, please. There we go. There you can see John's drawn a horse with 6-pack and sort of balloon thighs. Very good. And that's our Premier League predictions. Goodbye.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.